They weren't just lovers. They were a storm tearing through Depression-era America. Armed with guns, grit, and a taste for rebellion, Bonnie and Clyde didn't run from danger, they invited it. But how did two small-town dreamers become the most wanted couple in the country? Life in America during the Great Depression was a daily struggle. Families lost their homes. Banks foreclosed without mercy, and once prosperous men now stood in breadlines. In that climate, distrust of institutions grew deep roots. For some, it became easier to sympathize with those who stole from banks than with the banks themselves. Outlaws began to represent defiance against a system many felt had failed them. Into that discontent stepped Bonnie and Clyde, whose journey from troubled youths to infamous fugitives felt like something from a dime store novel, except it was all too real. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1, 1910, in the tiny town of Rowena, Texas. Her father died when she was just 4, and her mother moved the family to the rough suburbs of West Dallas. Despite the hardships, Bonnie was bright and artistic. She loved literature, wrote poetry, and dreamed of a life that extended far beyond the dry Texas plains. She married young, at 16, to a man named Roy Thornton, but he was quickly swept into the criminal underworld and sentenced to prison. Bonnie never saw him again, yet she never officially divorced him. She would die wearing his wedding ring. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born a year earlier, in 1909, to a family of tenant farmers. They too were crushed by poverty, relocating to a West Dallas shantytown after their farm failed. Clyde's early years were steeped in desperation, which soon led to crime. He started small, stealing chickens, then cars, and eventually turned to robbing stores. In and out of jail, Clyde found himself imprisoned at Eastham Prison Farm, one of the most brutal penal institutions in Texas. It was there, many say, that the petty thief turned into a hardened outlaw. Prison life left deep psychological scars on Clyde. He witnessed violence, was allegedly sexually assaulted by another inmate, and ultimately murdered that abuser with a lead pipe, with help from another prisoner. That moment, combined with harsh labor and abuse by guards, forged a hatred for the system that would define his life. In January 1930, a wounded and drifting Clyde met Bonnie at a friend's house in Dallas. The connection was instant. She was artistic and passionate. He was bold and restless. Just weeks into their courtship, Clyde was arrested and sent back to prison. But Bonnie, smitten and already deeply loyal, smuggled him a pistol hidden in a book. He used it to escape, was quickly recaptured, but his early release in 1932 reunited them, for good. What followed was a criminal partnership unlike any other. Clyde didn't set out to be a legend. He wanted to get a better life. But was 1929, an era of desperation began to smother the American spirit. Banks collapsed, homes were lost, and entire communities found themselves plunged into uncertainty. It was a time when trust in institutions eroded, and the lines between right and wrong began to blur. Out of this backdrop of economic despair and social unrest, two young Texans, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, emerged not as mere criminals, but as symbols of rebellion. They were lovers, partners in crime, and ultimately, doomed legends. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born in Rowena, Texas, in 1910. After her father died when she was just 4 years old, her mother moved the family to a working-class neighborhood in West Dallas. Bonnie was bright, artistic, and often daydreamed about becoming a poet or actress. She married young, just 15, to a man named Roy Thornton, but that marriage was short-lived. He landed in prison, and she never saw him again. Still, she wore her wedding ring until the day she died. The loss and loneliness she endured seemed to create a hunger in her, for love, for escape, and maybe for a sense of purpose in a world that hadn't given her many options. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born in 1909, just outside of Dallas. Like Bonnie, he came from poverty. His family lived in a tent by the Trinity River during the worst years of the Great Depression. Clyde started stealing chickens as a boy, and by his late teens, he was robbing small businesses. But it was in prison that Clyde became something more dangerous. He entered Eastham Prison Farm in 1930, where brutality was routine and inmates suffered daily beatings. It was here that Clyde made his first kill, not out of greed, but for survival. According to those who knew him, he changed in that place. He emerged from Eastham colder, harder, and with a singular vow: he would never go back. Bonnie and Clyde met in January 1930 at the home of a mutual friend in West Dallas. Bonnie was 19, Clyde was 20. It's said that the connection was instant, electric. Bonnie saw in Clyde a sense of daring, a romantic outcast with dreams of more than just survival. Clyde saw in Bonnie a fearless spirit, someone who wasn't just willing to follow him, but someone who could keep up. Their bond deepened quickly, and within weeks Clyde was arrested again. While in jail, Bonnie smuggled him a gun. He used it to escape, but was caught again and sent back. Yet their loyalty only strengthened, and when Clyde was finally paroled in 1932, he returned to Bonnie and to a life on the run. Their early crimes were petty: gas station holdups, small-time robberies. But it didn't take long for things to escalate. Clyde formed what would become known as the Barrow Gang, which included his older brother Buck, Buck's wife Blanche, a young runaway named W.D. Jones, and a rotating cast of drifters. Clyde's favorite weapon was a Browning automatic rifle, military grade, stolen from a National Guard armory, and it gave the gang a brutal edge. Clyde didn't just rob banks, he killed when cornered. He didn't hesitate. He shot first and left quickly. Their crimes grew more violent. Police officers were gunned down in ambushes, and store clerks were shot during robberies gone wrong. They became notorious not just for their ruthlessness, but for their ability to disappear. They traveled constantly, covering hundreds of miles in stolen Ford the 5th 8S, which Clyde adored for their speed and power. They slept in forests, farmhouses, abandoned cabins, anywhere the law wouldn't find them. But lawmen did find them, again and again. Each time, gunfire would erupt, and each time, Bonnie and Clyde would vanish into the horizon, wounded but alive. One of the most defining moments in their story came in April of 1933 in Joplin, Missouri. They were holed up in a rented apartment with Buck and Blanche, lying low, but neighbors became suspicious of the loud noise and unfamiliar cars. Local police staged a raid. The shootout that followed was violent and chaotic. Clyde fired round after round with his automatic rifle. The gang escaped, but in their rush they left behind something vital: a roll of undeveloped film. The photographs inside, showing Bonnie and Clyde posing with guns, cigarettes, and cocky smiles, were splashed across newspapers nationwide. In one iconic image, Bonnie points a pistol at Clyde as he pretends to surrender. In another, she strikes a pose with a cigar in her mouth. These images transformed them. They weren't just outlaws anymore, they were celebrities. But behind those sensational headlines was a reality marked by exhaustion and pain. In June of 1933, Bonnie suffered a terrible injury. During a high-speed escape, Clyde crashed their car into a dry riverbed in Oklahoma. The battery acid from the damaged engine splashed onto Bonnie's leg, severely burning her. The burns were so bad that her flesh peeled away from the bone. Clyde carried her, quite literally, for weeks. He bathed her wounds with stolen supplies, kept her out of hospitals, and even lifted her from the car when they traveled. They were hunted, injured, and exhausted, but they stayed together. Their final months were steeped in blood. The Barrow Gang's numbers dwindled. Buck was killed in a shootout. Blanche was captured and later blinded in one eye. The walls were closing in. As their crimes mounted, kidnappings, burglaries, more murders, law enforcement doubled their efforts. In early 1934, Clyde orchestrated a daring raid on the Eastham prison farm, freeing several inmates. This act outraged Texas authorities, who viewed it as a direct attack on the state's power. They hired a retired Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer to hunt them down. Hamer was relentless. He studied their routes, watched their patterns, and slowly closed the net. In May of 1934, Hamer and his team learned that Bonnie and Clyde would be visiting a secluded back road near Bienville Parish, Louisiana. There, early in the morning on May 23rd, they set up an ambush. Bonnie and Clyde approached in a stolen Ford. They were unarmed, unaware, and driving fast. The officers opened fire before the car even stopped moving. Clyde was hit first, one bullet through the head. Bonnie screamed, reaching for him, just before a storm of bullets tore through her. The officers didn't stop firing until they were certain the pair was dead. In total, more than 130 rounds were fired. Their bodies were riddled with bullets, so many that undertakers struggled to prepare them for burial. The public reaction was swift and surreal. Thousands came to view their bodies at the funeral homes. Clyde was buried in West Dallas. Bonnie was laid to rest elsewhere, despite her wish to be beside him. The car they died in, a blood-stained Ford riddled with bullet holes, was put on display and toured across the country like a twisted trophy of the era. In the years that followed, Bonnie and Clyde would be remembered not just for their crimes, but for the myth they left behind. Some saw them as monsters, others as martyrs. Hollywood embraced their tale in 1967, when Arthur Penn directed Bonnie and Clyde, with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway portraying the doomed lovers. That film, though controversial, redefined their story for a new generation, presenting them as rebels against a corrupt system rather than simple murderers. But the truth is always more complicated. Bonnie and Clyde were not heroes. They killed lawmen and civilians. They terrified towns and shattered families. Yet their story resonates because of what they represented. Two people, damaged and desperate, lashing out at a world that offered them little. They lived fast, loved hard, and died young, just as Bonnie once wrote in one of her last poems. Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. Their legend endures because it taps into something timeless, a fascination with outlaws, with love under fire, and with the people who choose to burn their names into history, even if it costs them everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and consider subscribing to Cyber Theo.